What are you reporting?
We got someone or something crawling around out here.
Did you see what it was? Was it a person or an animal or?
I can't tell. All I know is that my central light came on and I just happened to glimpse and see this thing running across the yard. A good-sized man or something. It looks like a man. I don't know what it was, just that it ran across the yard.
Okay. You've had problems in the neighborhood before?
Yeah, my dog was killed here just recently. I don't know what it was. Whatever it is, it's running. I couldn't catch it if I was going to chase it. But whatever it was, it was standing up. I'm out here looking through the window now and I don't see anything. I don't want to go outside. Jesus Christ, you better...
Sir?
Dio!
Hello?
Get somebody out here.
What's going on now, sir?
That son of a bitch is about 6'9", I don't know.
Do you see him now, sir?
Yes, I'm looking right at him.
Uh-oh. Okay, hang on.
He's right...
Is he in your yard, sir?
Yeah, God, he's big.
Okay, what's he doing in your yard?
He's looking at me.
Oh, and the guy is on foot.
I don't know what... It's a big... real big person. That's all I can say.
Okay, but it is a person.
Yeah, I'd say it was a person, somebody really big. But he's all in black.
Is he a black male or a white male? Did you actually see whether, or was he just wearing black?
He's all black and he's big. He is big.
Hi, I'm Mark Madison, the historian at the National Conservation Training Center, and I'd like to welcome you to another in our series of afternoon broadcasts we call Conservationists in Action. As you might have guessed from the 911 call, we have a slightly different show today with a very interesting guest talking about cryptozoology and whether Bigfoot exists or not. But first I'd like to introduce our guest who's been to NCTC many times. Larry Battson is a wildlife educator. He's come out here with his wife Cheryl. Virtually every open house I think we've had since we opened.
How many has it been, 10?
We've had 10, yeah.
Yes.
So you've been to all of them. He comes out with rehabilitated wildlife, baboons, snakes, all sorts of wonderful animals, teaches families about their habits and wildlife natural history, and he's a good friend of NCTC. But he has another very strong interest, and that is in the natural history of Bigfoot. And that's why we've invited him here this afternoon to learn something new and to see what evidence there might be out there to prove there's a Bigfoot. So Larry, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to have you here. And if you wouldn't mind starting out, tell us how you got interested in Bigfoot.
Well, the first time we came out to NCTC was with Jim Fowler from the old television program, Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom.
Sure.
We have done a lot of work with Wild Kingdom over the years. In other words, Jim does not really have his own animals, so when he makes an appearance somewhere, the first thing he'll say, bring your animals. So there's a network of people that he knows all across the country that have animals that they use in lecture work, like we use our animals in about 250 schools a year. So he invited us to the Callaway Gardens in Columbus, Georgia, to bring some animals down for some presentations there. So over breakfast one morning, he was talking about his recent trip to Russia, and he was working on a television program that lasted, I think, maybe 1-2 seasons for ABC called The Spirit of Adventure. And they'd gone to Russia to film the Russian brown bear. Well, over breakfast, he proceeds to tell me, he says, I was over there with these Russian guides, and he said all they wanted to talk about was Bigfoot, because they had seen something over there. They had found these footprints in the same areas that they were filming these bears, and they'd heard about the stories from Northern California, Oregon, and Washington. So over breakfast, we're talking about this, and I thought, I'd had a mild interest about it in the past. I'd read a couple books, and I thought there might be something to this. So it wasn't long after that, I got a phone call from a gentleman that produced a recreational show in Cleveland, Ohio. And he said, Larry, we're always looking for something new. He said, do you have any ideas for some type of exhibit or presentation we could do? So I said, well, let's have some fun. Let's do a thing on Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Yeah. In fact, he says, I will even build a Sasquatch. And I'll put this whole display together. And they said, well, let's take it a step further. He says, let's get an expert from British Columbia. Make some phone calls. So I called, first of all, I called Willow Creek in Northern California. Because through the books that I'd read, I'd heard about this film that had been made by Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin, the Patterson-Gimlin film. So I was putting together things for this exhibit, and so I called the variety store. I said, what do you have on Bigfoot? He said, I got coffee cups, I got bumper stickers, I got posters. Fantastic. I said, do you have any eyewitnesses of people that have claimed they've seen Bigfoot? He says, hold on a minute. He says, I've got a couple numbers on a piece of paper inside of my wallet. He says, give me a moment. Let me see if I can get those numbers for you. Well, the two numbers that he gave me was a gentleman named John Green and another gentleman named Bob Titmus, and they both lived in Harrison Hot Springs, British Columbia. He said they'd been through here a couple years ago. He said, try and give these fellas a call. So the first one that I called was John Green. Well, I find out, and didn't know about this at all, that he is a journalist, and he'd been involved with this since about 1958. He'd written several books on the subject. Called him up at home, and he was real talkative, and he said, well, there's people that might talk to you. And I said, well, I've got another number of this fellow named Bob Tip. He says, well, he's my neighbor. He just lives 2 streets over. He says, give him a call. So I called him. First of all, he was pretty dry. He didn't really want to talk to me. It was the last part of his life. In fact, he was very ill. So I told him, I said, and I couldn't get anything out of him. So I says, I'm putting together this Bigfoot presentation, this exhibit for school children. Well, that was just like opening the floodgates. So he was willing to help me then. So one of the first questions I asked him, I says, have you ever seen one? Now, before I'd made these phone calls, this Bigfoot exhibit, this display, I was going to have fun with it. I was going to be very sarcastic. I said, well, this is going to be good for a laugh. So he got real quiet on the phone. He says, after I asked him whether he'd seen one, he says, I have. I said, can you tell me about it? He says, well, the first time was in 1941 off the coast of Alaska in the Wrangell Narrows. He says, I was in the Navy and I was on a naval ship. He says, all the guys were down in the ship playing cards. It was just about dark. He said, I decided to walk up on the deck to smoke a cigarette. So he walks up on the deck of the ship and he's got this beautiful view of this Alaskan coastline. Well, he looks along what they called the shore of this beach. Well, he called it the beach. They call it the beach up there. And he sees this animal, creature, whatever, that walked upright. He said it was about 7.5 feet tall, chestnut brown in color. He said what was so remarkable was the size of it, and then you could basically see this was a very powerful animal. And he watched it walk along the beach and then up into the bush, into the forest. So this wasn't registering in his mind what he had just seen. Now, he was also a taxidermist and a hunter. And as he put it, he says, I have killed and stuffed every animal that's indigenous to this area, supposedly. He says, I've never seen anything like this before. He says, so as soon as he got out of the Navy, he decided that his goal in life was to hunt this animal. So he's in Kitimat, British Columbia in 1963 by himself. And he walked up to this huge rock wall, and he said he watched 3 of these animals go up this rock wall, freestyle rock climbing. You know, you've seen it on television where the guys use the chalk and they go up El Capitan in Yosemite. He said he watched them do the same thing. He said they'd reach up, feel for a crack, pull their entire body up. He says there was a big one, a medium size, and a real small one. So he assumed it was a family. And he said what would have taken a rock climber all day to accomplish, he said they did it in about 30 minutes. After that phone call, after I talked to this man for a long time, I mean, my phone bill was British Columbia, changed from then on. I thought, whoa. I said, there's got to be something to this. I said, it's either the most amazing animal that we have on this planet or the greatest hoax ever created. So I proceeded to talk to him, and they told me, they said, are you familiar with the Patterson-Gimlin film? It had been shot in Bluff Creek, California. I said, well, I've seen it a little bit on, a couple shows.
Sure.
And, but he says, you need to get that film. I said, okay. So I called, Roger Patterson had passed away, so I called his wife, and I was able to get a videotape copy of the film. And I looked at it a couple hundred times probably. And then I called Bob Titmus back because he was the one, after that film had been shot, he'd been in that area. In fact, he knew that area 10 times better than Roger Patterson or Bob Gimlin. Mm-hmm. And after that film had been shot, they took the film up to the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Well, Bob was up there on the first showing. Now, here they sit in this room, and they're looking at this 16mm film. Now, a lot of people, when they look at it, and we'll be able to see it here in a moment, they'll say it's so jerky, it's out of focus. Well, my dad had one of those cameras, and we have entire vacations that are that way, let alone trying to film some kind of a creature. So I called Bob up after I'd viewed it a few times, and I said, well, tell me your take on the film. He says, well, I went there after we sat in that room with scientists. And he said the scientists all sat there and said, this is a hoax. This is a guy in a suit. And he sat there and he says, they're clueless. He says, they don't know what they're talking about. He said, that is the same animal that I saw in the Wrangell Narrows in Alaska. That's the same animal I watched climb a cliff in Kitimat, British Columbia. He said, it's over. We now have proof that it exists. It's done. Well, there wasn't a scientist in there that was willing to say that was actually a living animal. So he says, I'm going to go to Bluff Creek. He says, I'm going to find the footprints this animal left, and I'm going to try to come up with the answers. So he did that. And what had happened the day the film had been shot, that night they were still in the area, and there had been a heavy rain, and it had left several footprints along the sandbar. So they decided to preserve the footprints. They covered them with bark and leaves, what Bob Gimlin told me. And so it took Bob a while to figure out where this film had been shot, because if anybody's been in the area, it's pretty rough country. Well, when he finally found those footprints, he tracked it. Bob was an expert tracker. I mean, he was so meticulous. He'd go through the woods and find little bitty hairs that something had left on a tree branch or something. He said, I followed that trail of this thing, and as you watch the film, it goes on up this mountain. Mm-hmm. And he says, up on this ridge, there was pebbles about the size of a golf ball that were covered with green moss. He said you could see where this thing had set its heels down into the pebbles and where its buttocks had set down. And from this vantage point where this animal was at, it had a perfect view of the valley below. In other words, while those guys were pouring plaster in those footprints and making those casts, this thing was watching them at the same time. So one of the arguments on it is, why did it stay in the open? Well, I've sat in a room with a couple people of knowledge, Native Americans, and they said, it's kind of like the bird with a broken wing stays in the open to keep the predator away from someone else, its baby. Because Bob Gimlin told me they'd found 3 different sizes of footprints in that area. And then the one that this animal left had a 16-inch footprint. It's a big Absolutely. And when they walked through the area, the footprint was pretty deep. They couldn't even hardly make an impression into the sand. So basically, it was staying in the open. That's the theory, because there was 2 others in the general vicinity. And people look at that film and they say, well, it kind of looks like a guy in a suit with a mask on. Well, right before that film had been shot, there'd been a major flood that had gone through there, and that whole river bottom was like logs and stones. And as you watch this film, it walks dead ahead, very definite strides, until it turns around and looks at it, and then goes straight ahead. Well, as it does this, think about this. Remember when you were on Halloween when you were a kid, and you'd put a mask on and a suit? I mean, every step you'd have to be looking down thinking, what am I going to trip over the neighbor's rake or something? Whereas in this film clip, you watch it, it walks straight ahead. There's no hesitation whatsoever. And we'll take a look at it here.
Okay, let's see the film.
See the muscles moving. In fact, the Disney people looked at this after it had been shot to get their impression on it, and they said, well, the only people that could put together something that was this authentic or this real was us, and we didn't do it. And so it makes one think a little bit So what's going on here? So, okay, I was ready to say they exist in California, Northern California, Oregon, and Washington. So we go to this RV show in Cleveland. We do this big exhibit, and John Green was in. We had a chance to talk and so forth. So I'm in my room that first night, and basically from 10 o'clock in the morning till 8 o'clock when the show talk ended that day, all we talked about was Bigfoot. I was burned out. I says, I'm so sick of talking. So I get a phone call in my room, and the guy says to me, I want to talk about Bigfoot. I go, well, the show opens at 10 tomorrow. I'll be there all day, so if you want to come out, and we'll be happy to chat about it. And he says, and this is his exact words, he says, I've been at war with these things. I says, what? I says, where do you live? He says, I live in Conneaut, Ohio. So I said, well, tell me a little bit about war with whatever this is. He says, well, we have a very rural, remote area. We built a home. And as we were building this home, they'd get so far in the framework and something would come in and tear it out. So they're thinking it's either kids or maybe a bear or something, whatever's doing it. So they put a guard on it, and they finally got the home up. So they've been in this home for about 2 weeks, and weird stuff would happen. They had this beautiful apple tree in the back, and one day it'd be full of apples, the next day the apples would be gone. There wouldn't even be any laying on the ground. So he's thinking, what in the world's going on here? Well, behind his house, he had a friend, the guy he worked with, said, hey, my wife just kicked me out. He says, I've got this trailer. Can I plug in behind your house? I'll keep it well away. You won't even know I'm there. So I said, okay, that'd be fine. So he sets up his little trailer. Well, one night the guy works late, comes home 11, 12 o'clock at night. He pulls in the driveway and he says, something ran across the road in front of me. He says, what? He says, something. He says, I don't know what it was. It could have been a bear, but it looked like to me it was walking on 2 legs. So then the guy's thinking, oh my God, I've got a nut living behind me. I says, this guy must have some kind of problems. I says, I think I've made a big mistake here. So the guy walks on back to his trailer, and this fellow stands out by his garage, and he's smoking a cigarette. And he says, Larry, he says, I could hear it. I said, I could hear it walk all around my house, across the ridges. He says, very definite, 2 footsteps, very loud. And he said, I heard it go toward an area called Jumbo Woods. So he didn't think any more about it. He turned off the garage light, went to bed. 5 o'clock that morning, something walked up by his windows and started screaming so loud that he says the window literally vibrated, and both him and his wife sat straight up in bed. He kept a pistol right by his bed, so he grabs the pistol. He runs outside and he hears this thing screaming. So he aims, shoots in the dark, gets quiet. No sounds, but he hear it walking around. So he goes back in, and wife says, what was it? He says, oh, I think it's a bobcat. He says, no big deal. Okay. Happens the next night, and this time what happens is the wife's bounding out of bed. She's throwing clothes in her suitcase, and she's moving to the Holiday Inn. Decides she doesn't want to live in this little rural wooded area in Conneaut, Ohio any longer. So this went on for some time till he finally got a good look at this thing. And he said he described it as being about 7 feet tall. He's covered with brown hair.
Yeah.
And he said when he saw it, it was standing up against a security light. And he could see the shadow of it. And he said we just stood there kind of rocking back and forth. And he could see the shadow of this thing. And then it dawned on him, he said, these things won't walk into the light. So he said, I think I've solved the problem about him coming around the house. He lit his house up like Shea Stadium. But he'd have weird things happen. And he would keep a journal of this. In fact, when first time I went to his house and had a chance to talk to him in person, I looked at this journal. I said, man, I wish I had the time to read all this. He says, if you give my wife about a month, she will type it all out for you. And she'll send it to you. And that's exactly what she did. She sent us this journal. And I'll tell you, it's some of the most fascinating reading. And this guy's just blue-collar worker. He's a welder. I mean, he has no reason to do this. Well, he finally got really upset, and he started calling newspapers and TV, and the neighbors just hated him after that. And he had all kinds of problems with them. They called him a nut and everything. So finally one day a fella came up to him. He said, "Why are you doing this?" He says, "Why are you telling people about this?" He said, "Well, I didn't know what to do." He says, "This thing has been around here as long as I have. This thing has been around, my dad has." And he says, "There's nothing you're going to do about it. And here's the thing. Nobody's ever going to believe you, because to people, this is a myth." I'm going to tell you right now, I have had innumerable amounts of people talk to me describing to me the same animal that we have talked about here and we've seen on this film forever. I mean, it's
the Midwest is a fairly new location for Bigfoot, though. Traditionally,
well, that's what I thought.
You hear about them in the Northwest or the West Coast? Or
Absolutely. In Alaska and British Columbia. In fact, one of the maps that I have of sightings in British Columbia, you see these real small areas where they've been sighted. But you get to look, and if you look on a regular map, these are where towns are. So all this tens of thousands and millions of acreage where nobody lives,
right,
where nobody goes, of course, that's why there's no sightings in there until people happen to venture into those areas. See, to the Native Americans in many parts of the country, this is a fact of life. I mean, this is just as real as the mountain lion, the bear, the deer. And, of course, the thing is, well, you know, we don't have a body. Right. But, you know, old Daniel Boone, in his journals, he claims that he actually shot one of these things and buried it somewhere in Kentucky.
What did he call it?
He called it a Sasquatch, I believe, because that's what the Native Americans call it. But yeah, or a wild man.
Which Native Americans? What parts of the country did Native Americans claim to see Sasquatch?
Washington, California, Oregon, British Columbia, all through up Canada. It's everywhere. These things have been reported in every state but Rhode Island and Hawaii. There's some type of documentation, people saying that they've seen these. I received an email from a gentleman, and he had read about some of my reports that I'd filed on the internet through a couple of the sites. And he's a correctional officer in the state of Washington, and he has a cabin 5 miles from the Canadian border. And he said, "I've read what you've said." He said, because you're a wildlife person, he says, "I want to share some stuff with you." He says, "But here's the thing." He says, "I don't want Monster Quest in my backyard." So if you can,
Monster Quest being a show,
the television show,
yeah,
absolutely. He says, "I don't want him in my backyard." I says, "I don't want people to know where this has been going on because I don't want it." He says, "There's a reason I built this cabin. I want to be left alone. This is my vacation home. It's not my fault these things have shown up or have been there since I showed up. They already were there." So he sent me these footprints in the snow it was a 23-inch footprint with an 8-foot stride that was about 5 inches wide. And I think that they might have those on our pictures that we brought to share with you today. I probably threw him for a loop there.
Okay.
But we'll have a chance to look at. Well, what's wild when you look at these pictures is that when you walk in the snow, there's usually a little drag mark in the front and the back of your footprint. There's none. And these footprints were several inches deep. And this gentleman said that he weighs probably as much as I do. It's 200 pounds, but lie. He walked on top of the snow. He couldn't even make an impression in the snow. Wow. And he followed these footprints, and he says he followed them for a while, and they joined another set of footprints that were about 16 inches long that had a 4-foot stride. And these footprints are like middle of nowhere. He just happened to be walking or driving down the highway and looked over in the side of the snow, and he saw these things. He says, "Whoa, what was that?" Then he went back and photographed them, and followed them for a while.
Is that what we're going to look at?
Yeah, I think so. He might have them up.
Now, where's the drawing from?
Well, that's a drawing I made. I'm a graphic illustrator, so I'll have people describe to me what they saw, and this is what some gal saw looking in her window one evening. I said, "You sure it wasn't your husband?" And if it's her husband, he's not very pretty. Here they are. And I'll tell you what, when I first saw these footprints, I got chills. I thought, whoa. I said, look at those. And you can see all around it, there's nobody that's been walking there before.
Right.
There's a little closer look at them. But what he was amazed at was it was an 8-foot stride. We're talking about an animal that had to be at least 8 or 9 feet tall. These are footprints found in my state of Indiana last year that were pretty interesting. Now, this is a footprint that was found. I took a group of teachers on a field trip, and one of the teachers were interested in footprints, and she looked down in the mud and saw this one. This footprint was about 15 inches. And she said, and there it is from a distance. And she said, Mr. Batson, what is that? And I says, you don't really want to know. And then she just pressed me. She says, no, what is it? I says, it's a Sasquatch. Well, they're not real. What can I say?
Their footprints are.
There are footprints back here in the middle of nowhere. And our field trip was supposed to be all day. The most amazing thing was all of a sudden all the teachers had to go home and prepare dinner for their husbands.
Now, where is this footprint?
That was from Indiana. Yeah, that one was from Indiana as well. This is Jerry Crew. This is the fellow that came up with the name Bigfoot because they'd find these huge footprints around their construction equipment in Northern California. This is one of the plaster casts that were made, and this was one of the first photographs that appeared in newspapers all over the country. Now, this is really strange. This was found in the middle of nowhere in Hoosier National Forest in the state of Indiana. And yet I have no answers for this one, where literally a circle of branches were stacked up about a foot and a half tall. Now, I'm not saying what created this, but it makes no sense to me. And this is the same area that they also found these huge footprints. And of course, this is the Patterson-Gimlin film, and that was the first magazine that published the reports of that they'd shot the film. Argosy magazine was the only ones that were willing to buy the rights. They took it to National Geographic, but National Geographic was afraid.
The Patterson-Gimlin film?
Mm-hmm.
Why did they have a movie camera out there?
That's what they were after.
Oh, they were looking for Bigfoot.
They were shooting a documentary on Bigfoot, and it was just I would say it's a stroke of luck, but according to Bob Gimlin and his wife, it's not, because he's been harassed his entire life. His wife she'd preferred they'd never been on that trip, and had done that because it's. In fact, I talked to him a while back. There was one of the Discovery shows that said that some guy said, I was the fella in the suit for the Patterson-Gimlin film. And I asked him about that. He said, I don't know why people would lie about that. He said, and he's never profited from it.
Right.
He sold the copyrights years ago for $1, nothing. But here's my take on it. If you looked at this film,
because we're looping it right now.
If you look at it close, this is a female Sasquatch because she has breast. Okay. Roger Patterson was a rodeo rider. Mm-hmm. Bob Gimlin trained horses for trail rides and for backpacking trips. They had no expertise in the creation of any type of costumes. So let's say they build this costume and they get it all done. And they're saying to themselves, well, this is a pretty good suit, but we should put some breast on it. It just doesn't add up.
No, that is a lot.
Absolutely. And also, like I said earlier, Bob Gimlin never profited from the creation of this film. So if it was a hoax and he basically got the word gypped out of any money, that human nature tells me right away if this was going bad for him, he'd be the first one to raise his hand saying, it was a hoax. It was a guy in a suit all along. And to this day, when I talk to him on the phone, he's just the nicest fellow in the world. And he says, let me tell you, he says, when I was on horseback, he says, I had a shotgun on that thing because we didn't know what it was going to do. And he says, what I saw, he says, I don't think anybody snuck back there and put a suit on and walked in front of us, because what I saw was pretty impressive. And he says, to this day, my memory, it's just like it happened yesterday. It's still very, very fresh.
Now, you're a wildlife educator. When you look at a film like that, what are you looking for? I mean, are you looking at its stride? Are you looking at how it reacts around people? What strikes you that seems similar or different?
The first idea is it's a giant primate. Well, it's not a monkey. It's not an ape, because my feeling is if it was something that we'd already have one. This is human-like. And what I'm looking for is certain animal behaviors that tell me that first of all, tell me it's not a guy in a suit. Because if you look at it, believe me, it's been studied. It's not a guy in a suit. This is it. This is the animal. And there's just no doubt about it. Anybody that said they can spot a zipper on the back of that suit, and believe me, there's been so much. It's wrong. I've talked to too many people that's been directly involved with the film that makes me realize that is the only real documentation we have of this animal. And there's a lot of animals on this planet that we don't have an extensive amount of film footage on. I mean, there's a Sumatran tiger, hasn't been photographed too much in a while. We know that exists. The snow leopard of the Himalayas, there's not a lot of, there's been, but not a lot of extensive film footage, and we know that exists. Right. And of course, I get a kick out of the Monster Quest show. We did that show last year. They haven't aired it yet. They might be mad at me because they talk about they have these expeditions that they go on their four-wheel drive ATVs, and they take out their Winnebagos, and they hang their cam trackers on the tree so if something walks by, they'll get a picture of it. Right. And I told them, I said, you know what? I said, these guys in their camouflage, I said, I could put them in the mountains where we know mountain lions exist, and they're not going to find one of them. No. So how are they going to find something that's 10 times as wary and 10 times as intelligent? And the Native Americans, their problem with this whole thing of saying, hey, it's for real, especially on the reservations in Northern California, we discussed this earlier, they are afraid that if it's proven that it does exist, and there's documentation, as you know, that the government would classify it as an endangered species. And they're afraid that if it gets classified as an endangered species, that they will no longer be able to log or mine the areas that they do now. That'll be shut off. It's very similar to the spotted owl. Yeah. And the loggers in Oregon and Washington and California, it starts to get dark. They leave the woods. I've talked to them before, and they won't tell you why, but they give you the general idea. They said we respect this, and we just get out of the woods. I was doing a talk in Indiana, and I finished the talk, and I'm at the table putting my stuff up. This guy walks up. Everybody left. He said, "Let me tell you something." He said, "I was fly fishing in Washington one time. We were back here on the stream," he says, and I looked over in the woods, and I saw a rock that weighed about 300 pounds. It was like it was being catapulted out of the forest and landed in the middle of that river. He said, I didn't have to see anything. He said, every hair on the back of my neck stood up. He says, I reeled in my rod. He says, we were done for the day. He says, I totally believe that these things do exist.
And the fish were spooked anyway.
Absolutely. Yeah, the fishing would have been bad after that. And supposedly on Mount St. Helens, that right after the eruption, and there's this pumice for acres and acres, millions of acres, that there was very good footprints found in that ash after Mount St. Helens. And then it wasn't long ago that I read on one of the sites on the internet, there's a site, Bigfoot Encounters. In fact, I submit quite a few reports that I get to that site, that they were taking animals that had been killed in the eruption off because they're afraid the decomposition of all these mass amounts of deer and elk and bear were going to pollute these waters for a long time. So they were basically filling nets and then hauling them out via helicopter. And I had read that a fellow on another helicopter looked over one of these nets full of dead animals, and he could distinctively see hanging from the net 2 charred-looking arms in that harvest of animals. So I don't know. It's it's a really interesting story, though.
Is there other video footage of Bigfoot or something?
Well,
what term do you prefer? I mean, I'm no expert on the subject. Do people that are interested in the field regularly use Bigfoot or Sasquatch?
Yeah,
or?
both.
Okay.
Yeah. So I kind of like. It doesn't really matter. The Native American Sasquatch works for me.
Okay. Is there other
big hairy guy?
Is there other? Is that what Sasquatch means? And then they...
Forest people, I believe, or something like that.
Okay.
But
is there other video footage of?
Well, there's video footage that's purported of one, but nothing that compares to what Roger Patterson and Patterson-Gimlin had filmed that day.
Have you seen stills that you find convincing?
No. And that's the wariness of this animal. I mean, it's pretty incredible. I have to go by human nature. And, I've always said, we can put someone in a court of law, and their testimony can put someone in prison for the rest of their life. Mm-hmm. But you put someone in that same situation under oath and tell them to describe what they had saw, and then when they finish, it's all a bunch of bull, and there's no truth to it. And I've had too many people walk up to me that have no reason to lie, describe events that I'm thinking, wow, it's and I try to leave this all the time. It drives my wife crazy. She says, I'm done with it, and then I'll be done with it, because I have no reason. I don't care if anybody believes whether it exists or not. I could care less. But I'll get that phone call, or I'll get that email, and I'll get like those footprint photographs, or somebody call me and talk to me and said, I had, well, in Washington, here's what they would do. He says, Larry, we got a place we go camping. He said, I think these things have gotten used to me. He says, because we'll go back in the spot, and we'll turn off all the lights, and we'll just kind of wait there, and we can hear them walking around in the forest. And we take these neon lights, the ones you pop, that glow in the dark. Glow sticks. They hang them from the trees, all around where they're waiting there in the woods. He says it's wild. He says, because we'll watch those glow sticks, and all of a sudden the glow sticks will get lifted, and they'll be like 8-9 foot up the tree. So it's not a raccoon dragging them off. So and he says, we'll watch them lift those glow sticks up, and it's like they're floating through the woods as they take off through the woods. He says it's the weirdest thing. And then he has a big horse trough he keeps behind his cabin. He says, I have to keep that horse trough filled with food, because if I don't and it's empty, he says, I'll be in bed at night. And he says, these things will come up beating on the side of my wall and screaming in my windows. And
sounds like bears when you feed them.
Yeah. It kind of does that.
We've talked about video and pictures. What does Bigfoot sound like, according to some of these reports?
Well, we have some sounds that were recorded in Washington.
Okay, should we start with that?
We should listen to those. And I've played these sounds, and to a lot of my friends who I consider wildlife experts, I says, I want an opinion. What animal is this? I says, is this some type of an owl? So we'll listen to those, and let's see.
Okay.
We'll see what you think.
Right.
I have to tell you, I was doing a talk and I played that tape.
Mm-hmm.
And it was in Columbus, Indiana. And I had a guy stand straight up in his seat. And he says, "My God, that is the same thing that I heard by our cabin down in southern Indiana." He broke out into a sweat. He says, "I've got to leave right now." He said, he was, and I tell you what, for the rest of the talk, I had that entire audience right here in my hand. And he left. And he called me. He says, "I have to bring my wife." He said, "Because I can't believe," he says, "you have those sounds recorded." And then after I finished the talk, I thought to myself, I need to have him come on every one of these.
We don't have him here today. Now, where was that recording from? And
Washington.
Washington State.
Washington. And in fact, right after those sounds, what would happen? People would hear these at night. And that was just, one of those macro cassettes. That's why the quality, it's okay, but and they just put it out you hear all the birds. It was real early in the morning. And he just set it on his window and recorded that one morning. And so what did you think?
I don't know what it was. It sounded like a monkey or something in the background. I'm not. As far as I know, there's no monkeys in Washington State.
I'm seeing that's happened too, because they've found like hair samples before, and they've taken them in for analysis, and they'll use it to unknown primate. Where did you collect these? Well, we collected them in Northern California. We collected them in Washington. There's no primates in this that we know of that live in that part of the world.
Sure.
And the footprints, there's tens of thousands of footprints that have been cast over the years. And
have you collected some of the casts?
Absolutely. And the experts that have looked at many of these footprints, obviously there's some people that have gone out and gotten big pieces of plywood and terrorized their neighbors by leaving footprints through their garden. That's happened. But things like dermal ridges, and you can see no two footprints are identical, where you can see where the body weight's been distributed. That there's been experts on footprints that have looked at them and said, hey, this is legitimately an animal. And now, in the last few years, it just isn't people living in a trailer tracking these things down. The scientific community has Jane Goodall, she definitely thinks there's something going on about this. And so several scientists are now in search of the answers for this.
Well, there is a historical record of that, which is the only thing I know about Bigfoot is as a historian. Fish and Wildlife Service briefly did a press release to discuss whether if Bigfoot were to be discovered, it would be put on the endangered species list, and we talked about some of the outcome of that. And the National Wildlife Federation was actually involved a number of years ago in doing a study on Bigfoot. We hold their archives, and that was one of the things that was in the archives that's been requested a couple of times.
Well, well, I've talked in Pennsylvania. I was doing some programs in Pennsylvania. I talked to a fish and wildlife guy there. I said, what happens when you get a report? He says, we'll make the people feel better, and he says, we'll take a bear trap out and set that up for them with the big...
Yeah, we have one in our archive.
Yeah. He says, we'll put that in their yard. It makes them feel a little bit better. I said, do you actually think one of these things, he says, we've got so many reports from hunters.
Really?
I've talked to hunters that have shot a deer, and they're walking up on the deer, and all of a sudden this thing walks out behind a tree, looks at the hunter right in the eye, and then grabs the deer, tosses it up over his shoulder, and walks off with it. I've had that story. I had a hunter that was in a deer stand in southern Indiana, and he was using coyote calls, and looked down, and one of these things walked up to his tree and looked up at him, and did about 2-3 circles around his tree, and then walked back into the woods. He stayed up in that tree stand for 8 hours before he had the nerve to come back down out of there. So when you hear people look at you in the eye and tell you this, it makes you think there's got to be something to it. And I'll tell you what, if you think one of these things exists, your little hike in the woods is a lot more interesting.
What about skeptics who question why we haven't found any bones or carcasses? Sure, they might be wary of people when they're alive, but when they're dead.
Well, there were some bones discovered in Conneaut, Ohio. In fact, it's in the Blue Book of what they call a large race of humans, and that is documented. In fact, I have those papers with me, and so
these are old bones that they.
They had been buried, and they were in some type of makeshift cemetery, and those were discovered. And there's a femur bone of what they still don't know. I think it's in California. I have to look that up for sure. And old Daniel Boone, like I said, he claims he'd killed one, and he buried it, and he told that story around a campfire, and everybody laughed at him, and he shut up about it from then on. And only in his journals later on. And you know, the great Teddy Roosevelt still talks about the time that he was in the wilderness areas of Montana, I believe, and he heard a sound, as his description is something I'd never ever heard before. So,
Very interesting. What would be convincing evidence to you?
Part of a body.
Part of a body.
Yeah, people ask me what would be the final evidence. Let's say if you found one dead, what would you do? Well, you're not going to carry the thing out because it weighs several hundred pounds. We said we just need a part of one. Yeah. We just need a finger. We just need a thumb, a hand. That's it. That's all you need. Then that would give the scientific community something that they could say, hey, this is for, there's something to this. And, as a wildlife educator, I have to be real careful with this because
Sure.
I go to school children and I lecture about wild animals and I don't want to kill my credibility, but now that the scientific community's grasped a hold of it, and what I've gathered over the last 30 years that I've done this, there's something to this.
Well, that's a good way to go out, and I would like to remind folks, Larry's a really good wildlife educator. He and his wife have been doing this for a number of years. We've had him out here numerous times. He's superb at that, and that's usually how we have him out here, but we thought we'd do something a little different, have a little fun, and do something we've never done in a distance broadcast. And we're going to do a public lecture with you out here tonight. And I have to say the phone has rung more for your public lecture than anyone I can remember in memory.
I am so thrilled the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has decided to go with this because, and I guarantee you,
I don't necessarily say this is the belief of our institution.
I'm going to tell you right now, there will be people in that audience tomorrow night that will come up to me and they'll say, I have seen or I know exactly what you're talking about. I guarantee it. And I know where they'll be sitting. They'll be sitting about 2/3 back in that audience. And they'll be kind of overlooking the whole situation. And after the presentation is over, they'll just kind of wander up and talk to me. And then when they get me aside when no one's around, because I figure 99% of the people that have ever seen something like this don't tell anyone because they want that nice little rural place they've built, that cabin in the woods. They don't want every nutty guy in camouflage trouncing there trying to bag him a Bigfoot.
Trying to bag him.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Larry, thank you so much for reminding us that the best part of nature is the mysterious part of nature.
Absolutely.
And this has been really fun, and I think as we go out, maybe we'll try to run that video footage one last time for the audience. But thanks again, Larry. Larry will be giving a talk at NCTC in the evening, one of our community lectures, and I'm sure we'll get him back at the open house, which is the third week in October, where he will probably not be coming with Bigfoot.
No, we have a new baby baboon, though.
Hopefully we'll be bringing out the new baby baboon if
and
it's
a new
ready.
bobcat we're raising right now. So.
Well, that'll be great. We'll
Yeah.
all be there. And Larry, thanks for all your help, and thank you for tuning in this afternoon. And as we go out, we'll show you one last video clip of that famous footage Larry's been talking about. So thank you.
Thank you very much.